Most people who come to me with tired legs, swollen ankles, or itching feet have already tried 2 or 3 things that did not work. A new pair of shoes, a different soap, a cream from the pharmacy. Sometimes a visit to the doctor who tells them their circulation could be better and to drink more water. And they do, and it helps a little. And then in 3 weeks the itching is back, or the swelling is back, or the bottoms of their feet feel like they are standing on warm coals at the end of the day. I want to tell you something that changes how you look at all of that. Not because I have a remedy to sell you. I have no store, no contract, no monthly shipment. I want to tell you because it took my own community a long time to understand what our elders were actually looking at when they looked at someone's feet. And once you understand it, you will never see a swollen ankle or a cracked heel quite the same way again. I am Amish. I farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on land my grandfather cleared before my father was born. I keep livestock, I tend a kitchen garden, and I have spent more years than I can count watching older people in my community age in ways that still surprise the English doctors who occasionally come through our townships. What I have noticed is this: the feet tell you things the face does not. The feet tell you things the blood test sometimes misses for years, and the organ they are most often talking about is one that most people never think about until it is already in trouble. That organ is the liver. Now, I understand that sounds like a large claim, so let me walk you through it the way my grandfather walked me through it. Slowly, in order, so that by the end you are not taking my word for it, you are seeing it yourself. The liver is the largest internal organ in the body. Most people know that. What most people do not think about is what it actually does every hour of every day. It filters your blood. Everything you eat, everything you drink, everything absorbed through the gut travels through the liver before it goes anywhere else. The liver decides what is useful and what is waste. It processes fats. It stores certain vitamins. It makes the proteins your blood needs to carry fluid properly. It breaks down old hormones so they do not keep circulating after their work is done. It produces bile, a fluid that helps you digest fat in the first place. That is an enormous amount of work. And here is what most people do not understand about an organ that carries that burden. When it starts to slow down, when the load builds faster than it can process, it does not send you a sharp pain the way a kidney stone does. It works quietly. It compensates. It reroutes. And the signs of trouble show up far away from where the trouble is. In the skin, in the sleep, in the energy, and most particularly down at the far end of the circulation, in the lower legs and the feet. Our elders understood this, not in the language of modern medicine. They did not talk about bile salts or hepatic portal pressure. They talked about what they saw. And what they saw, repeated across generations, was that certain things appearing on a person's feet and lower legs were worth paying attention to before the bigger problems arrived. They were not treating feet, they were reading them. The first thing is itching. Not the itching of dry skin, not the itching of a bug bite, a deep, stubborn itching on the soles of the feet or the lower legs that comes and goes without any visible cause. No rash, no redness, just an itch underneath the skin that no cream seems to reach. The older women in our community noticed this in the men as they aged past 50. They called it a sign of backed up blood. Modern research has a more specific explanation. When the liver is congested or slowed, bile salts can build up in the bloodstream. Those salts deposit under the skin, and the body's response to them is histamine release, the same chemical your body releases in response to an allergen. The itching you feel is your immune system reacting to something that should have been processed and cleared but was not. The itch is not a skin problem. It is a signal from a system under strain, and a cream applied to the outside will not reach what is happening on the inside. The second thing is heat. Hot feet, particularly in the evening. Feet that feel warm or even burning when there is no fever anywhere else in the body. The liver processes an enormous amount of chemical work, and that work generates heat. When the liver is under strain, one of the places that excess heat can express itself is through the peripheral circulation, the smallest blood vessels that reach all the way down to the toes. Our elders noticed that people who complained of burning feet in the evening often had other signs of sluggish digestion and poor energy within the same year. They were not seeing a strange connection, they were seeing a consistent pattern and giving it a name from what they knew. The third thing is swelling, specifically what the doctors call pitting edema, which means that if you press your thumb into the soft tissue just above the ankle and hold it a few seconds, a small dent remains when you lift your finger. Normal fluid springs back. Fluid that has backed up and settled into the tissue because the circulation is not clearing it, that fluid stays pressed. One of the liver's responsibilities is producing a protein called albumin, which keeps fluid inside the blood vessels where it belongs. When the liver is not producing enough of it, fluid leaks out of the vessels and pools in the tissue. Gravity pulls it to the lowest place, the ankles and the feet. The old farmers in my community checked for this the same way the doctors now check for it. They pressed their thumb above the ankle. They looked at what the skin did when they let go. The fourth thing is the heel. Cracked heels are common enough that most people think nothing of them. Dry skin, not enough lotion. But the pattern our elders noticed was that deep cracking at the rim of the heel, the kind that splits and sometimes bleeds, showed up repeatedly in people who had other signs of poor fat digestion. The explanation is direct. The liver produces bile. Bile emulsifies fat. Without proper bile flow, the body cannot absorb fat-soluble nutrients properly. Vitamins A and E in particular are essential to skin integrity. They are what keep the outer layers of skin elastic and able to hold moisture. When fat digestion is impaired, those vitamins do not absorb regardless of what you eat. The skin at the heel, which takes more mechanical stress than almost anywhere else on the body, is among the first places to show what the gut is not getting. The crack is not just dryness. It is the skin showing you what the liver is not processing. The fifth thing is the nails. Most people have seen toenails that are discolored, thickened, or slow to grow. Fungal infections are a common explanation, and often a correct one, but there is a specific pattern worth watching for. The small white half-moon at the base of each nail, what older books call the lunula, is connected to blood flow and nutrient delivery to the nail bed. When that moon disappears or shrinks significantly across multiple toenails, it sometimes reflects poor peripheral circulation. The gut microbiome, which is directly shaped by liver health, plays a role in what gets absorbed at the nail bed and what does not. Our grandmothers did not have that vocabulary, but they watched nails. They noticed when the moons went away and connected it to what else was happening in the same person at the same time. The sixth thing, and this one is rarely spoken of plainly, is smell. Not the ordinary smell of a long day of work. A particular smell coming from the feet and the skin, heavy, slightly sweet, slightly sour, that soap and washing do not quite remove. The liver is responsible for breaking down metabolic waste and preparing it for excretion through the kidneys. When the liver's capacity is reduced, some of that waste does not clear cleanly. The body has a secondary route, the skin. Compounds that should be processed and expelled through urine instead come out through sweat. The old farmers noticed that a certain smell on a man's skin meant something was not clearing the way it should. They had been watching long enough to know. Now here is where the story turns, because none of these individual signs is proof of anything on its own. A cracked heel is sometimes just a cracked heel. Swollen ankles sometimes mean too many hours on your feet at the end of a long harvest. An itch can be dry air in winter. Our elders understood this. They were not looking at one sign. They were looking at the pattern. 2 or 3 of these things appearing together in the same person, in the same season, that was what they paid attention to. That was when the older women in my community would begin asking questions about digestion, about sleep, about whether the person was waking in the small hours of the morning and finding it hard to return to sleep. Sleep is worth stopping on for a moment. The liver does much of its processing work in the overnight hours. People in our community who were eating heavy suppers close to bedtime, those people often woke in the early morning hours and could not get back to sleep. Not because of worry or noise, because something in the body was not quiet. Whether that waking is directly connected to liver activity or is simply the result of a digestive system still working at midnight, I cannot say with certainty. But the pattern was consistent enough that the elders treated that particular window of wakefulness as a signal worth noting and worth connecting to what a person ate and when. This brings me to what I actually want to share with you about what the Amish tradition did with all of this observation. Because the answer is not a remedy in the way most people expect. It is a set of habits, and the habits are simpler and more specific than anything you can buy. The first is the evening meal. In our community, supper has always been the lightest meal. The heaviest meal comes at noon. This is not religious custom. It is farming logic. You eat what you need before the afternoon work. By evening, you are winding down. You eat lightly. You give the gut time to settle before sleep. Giving the liver several clear hours between the last meal and bedtime is one of the oldest and most consistent habits in traditional farming communities across many cultures. Not just Amish. The working farmers of Germany, of Switzerland, of the communities our own people came from before they crossed the ocean, they all ate their largest meal in the middle of the day. The second habit is bitters before a meal. This is one that has nearly disappeared from common knowledge, even though it was once ordinary household practice. Bitter foods and herbs, dandelion greens, chicory, burdock root, raw radish, even the natural bitterness of an endive leaf stimulate bile production. A small amount of something bitter eaten before a meal starts the liver and gallbladder preparing for the work of digestion. Bile gets moving before the food even arrives. In our community, bitter greens in the spring were not simply a seasonal food, they were a practical tool. Dandelion greens from the field edge were eaten specifically in the weeks when people were coming out of a long winter of heavier, starchier eating. Not because someone had run a study, because the practice had been observed across enough generations that it became part of how you ate in spring. You cleaned out the winter with the first bitter things that came up out of the ground. Almost no one in modern life does this. The food in modern grocery stores has had the bitterness bred and processed out of it. Vegetables that were once naturally quite bitter have been selected over decades for sweetness and mild flavor. The palate has been trained to want sweet and salty, and to find bitter unpleasant. And in doing so, modern food culture quietly removed something that was doing a specific job in digestion without most people noticing it was gone. The third habit is movement after eating. A walk, not vigorous work. The custom after supper in our community was 15 or 20 minutes of slow walking, around the yard, down the lane, around the kitchen garden. This appears in traditional culture after traditional culture going back further than our own records. The practical effect on digestion is real. Gentle movement after a meal supports the movement of food through the gut and encourages the gallbladder to release bile. Light contraction of the abdominal muscles during walking creates a gentle pressure on the portal blood flow, the circulation that runs from the gut to the liver. A person who eats and immediately sits still, particularly one who eats their largest meal in the evening and then remains seated until bedtime, has removed every mechanical aid to that process. None of these habits requires a supplement or a subscription. They require understanding why the old arrangement was arranged the way it was, and that understanding is what modern convenience quietly replaced. When you can eat at any hour and take something to quiet the resulting discomfort, the incentive to understand the underlying pattern disappears. The pill handles the symptom. The pattern is never examined. That is the larger thing I have been circling around this entire time. The feet are not the story. The feet are the signal that a story exists. The story is about a system of connected habits that a farming community maintained for generations, not because they were wise in some distant mystical way, but because they had no alternative. When you have no specialist nearby, when the cost of being unwell falls entirely on the people around you and on the work that does not get done, you pay attention to patterns. You watch for the early signs. You act on the small things before they become the large ones. I have watched my own community age across many decades. The men and women who maintained these habits, the light evening meal, the bitter greens in spring, the walk after supper, those people carried their health differently past 60 and past 70 than the ones who had let the old patterns go. I cannot prove that in a laboratory. I am telling you what I observed across a long time, across many families, in a community where nothing about daily life changed quickly enough to hide the patterns. The feet are where I started this conversation because they are where the conversation often needs to start. They are the first place to look when something has been building quietly long enough to show itself somewhere. If you look at your own feet this evening and recognize 2 or 3 of the things I have described, I am not telling you that you have a serious illness. I am telling you that your body may be pointing at habits worth examining. The timing of your last meal, the amount of bitter food in what you eat, whether you walked after supper or sat still. My grandfather said something I have returned to many times. He said the body is a patient teacher but a poor debtor. It shows you what it needs long before the bill comes due. The trouble is that most people are not taught to read the early lessons. They learn to wait for the pain, the diagnosis, the signal that can no longer be ignored. By then, the lesson has been repeated many times without being heard. The feet are the early lesson. Most people have been taught to treat them as a maintenance problem. New shoes, better cushion, a soak in warm water. What if they are something else entirely? What if they are a letter, written in a language you were never taught to read? And what if that language is older than any pharmacy, older than any wellness trend, carried forward by ordinary people who watched bodies closely because the work of their lives depended on understanding what they were seeing? That is what I have been trying to pass along. Not a remedy for your feet, a way of reading what your feet are already trying to tell you, and behind that, a question that seems to me more interesting than any single answer I could give. How many other conversations is your body trying to have with you right now, in the quiet language of small symptoms and early signals that modern life has simply not taught you to hear? That question is worth sitting with longer than a video. The old farmers had whole lifetimes to practice listening to it. Most of us have not started yet. I want to add one more thing before I let you go, because it belongs to this conversation and I would not feel right leaving it out. There is a 4th habit that our community maintained without naming it in any formal way, and it is perhaps the hardest to recover once it has been lost. It is the habit of noticing. The old farmers noticed things. They noticed what the animals were doing. They noticed what the weather was doing 3 days before it changed. They noticed what a neighbor's complexion looked like at the feed store compared to the last time they had seen him. They noticed what their own bodies were doing at different hours, in different seasons, on different kinds of food. Not in an anxious way, in the way that a person pays attention to something they are responsible for. Modern life has largely removed the conditions that required that kind of noticing. We are removed from the direct consequences of most things quickly enough that the feedback loop between cause and effect gets hard to read. You do not feel the connection between last night's late supper and this morning's poor sleep when there are a dozen other things that could also explain the sleep. The patterns dissolve into the noise. What the traditional farming life preserved, through necessity more than intention, was a close enough relationship between action and consequence that the patterns stayed visible. You ate late and you slept badly and you noticed. You ate bitter greens and something settled in you and you noticed. You pressed your thumb above the ankle of an aging relative and the dent stayed and you understood without being told that something needed attention. The knowledge was never the remarkable part. It was the noticing. The knowledge came from the noticing, slowly, across many generations, until it became part of how a community moved through the world. What I find myself wondering, more often as the years pass, is not whether the old remedies work. Some do. Some are more folklore than function. That is worth separating out carefully and honestly. What I find myself wondering is what else we have stopped seeing simply because we stopped looking. What signals are already there, already consistent, already pointing at something worth understanding, that modern convenience has taught us to medicate rather than read? That is not a question I can answer for you. It is a question each person has to bring to their own body, in their own time, with enough quiet to actually hear what comes back.